Welcome to the Bmad Workflow. This video is going to go over the workflow of how you kind of daisy chain one agent's output to put into another. The other videos that are following this will tell you more specifically all the details regarding a particular agent. To find documentation of this, if you have Bmad installed, as by the previous video, if you expand Bmad core, you can go down to user guide here, right click and go open preview, and it should show like this. If you don't have the extension for Mermaid, it'll show the diagram in a weird format like this. So just make sure you have your markdown preview for Mermaid there. But going back to open preview, so you see most projects you kind of start off with the analyst. The analyst is there to help you do brainstorming, market research, competitor analysis, but overall the objective of what it is to create a brief.md. So you can see down here I've got a brief.md, and in the other videos I'll kind of show you how you use this analyst, how you could call on it here. As you can see, I have it typed up here, but the objective of the analyst, like I said, is to create a brief.md. Once you have a brief.md, this brief.md will be kind of like a brief overview of what the project is, what you're trying to solve, the type of people you're trying to solve it for, if it's for engineers or if it's for marketing or legal or whatever it may be. It's kind of showing what's in scope and what's out of scope. Once you have your brief.md, you then take that file and then you talk to your project manager, your PM. If you want to see where your agents are, you'll see up here in the top left, you'll see kind of there's these different agents. They have marked down files of kind of how they work. But continuing on, your objective of your PM is to create a PRD, as you see down here. The PRD will go in more technical detail about which things you want to accomplish, how you want to build it, like what things your infrastructure should look like, or your security. It just kind of goes a more detailed story or more detailed markdown file of what you're trying to accomplish. Think of the brief as just kind of from the analyst. It's like a brief overview of something that you could hand to an executive. The PRD from the PM is more of a technical dive into what you're trying to accomplish and how you're trying to solve the problem. Then after you have a PRD, you then often take that to your front end spec, your UI UX agent. So you'll see up here UI UX agent that helps you create a front end spec, like you see over here. I have a front end spec markdown file, or it helps you create a UI prompt to put in a lovable or version 0 web page to help you kind of create your front end interface of how you want it to look. Then from that, you take those three files, the front end spec, the brief, and the PRD, and you talk to your architect. Your architect agents will then take all of those and help you kind of formulate what your entire architecture is. As you see, that file is going to be quite large. So like here's an architecture document. So I scroll through it, you'll see it's quite extensive. I'm going to collapse this over here, but you'll see that this is a very lengthy document, as you can see. So going back, let's go back to where we were. So you have your analyst for your brief, your project manager for your PRD, your UI UX expert for your front end spec, then your architect for your architecture markdown file. So sometimes when AI works, it hallucinates. So how do we know that AI didn't hallucinate in making these slightly different? Your PRD, your front end spec, your brief, and your architecture. So maybe it hallucinated in the creation of one of those documents isn't fully aligned, and one document says one thing and another document says another thing. That's where the project owner comes into play. It'll come into play into multiple steps further down, but overall the objective, think of the project owner as like the validator or the person that checks everything. So like I said, AI hallucinates. The project owner, the PO, is always running checklists, making sure there's no hallucinations, make sure AI actually did what it's supposed to, and there's a line between all your documents that's checking that all these documents are properly aligned and not gone crazy. So after it's kind of gone through all of your PO does a checklist of all of these and kind of validates that all of these are aligned, you now have 4 fairly large documents. And if you try and add these to your context window every time you're trying to do something, it takes up a lot of space in your context window. Your context window, as it gets bigger, it tends to hallucinate. So you want to do something called sharding. So sharding will shard, you see here with your PO, after you've done your PO validation of everything, it now gives you the option to shard your documents. So you'll see this architecture document I have here, but you'll see kind of further up here that I have an architecture folder. It automatically takes this really large architecture document and breaks it into smaller markdown files. So when you're working in database things, it only grabs database relevant markdown files and excludes the other things because it doesn't need to do those, read those things and add those to the context window. More or less, it separates them like this so that only when you need the information of these markdown files does it pull it in to your context window for the particular story or epic that you're working on. So you'd want to shard your architect document and your PRD document. So you can see here I've sharded my architecture document to smaller markdown files. And then same with my PRD. I've got a breakdown of the PRD and each one has an index kind of showing what each of these do. So kind of organize it. Same thing in the architecture here. There's an index. So you kind of finish your planning phase once you get to this point. And once you've kind of done all of this, you kind of got your architecture, your brief, your front end spec, your PRD, and you sharded everything, it's time to kind of hand things over to your Scrum Master or SM. So when you kind of reach out and call your SM, which I go over in other videos, so it'd be like, SM, help me draft my first story. It would actually look at all of your documentation and draft the first story. I'm not going to hit in on this, but that's basically what you do, and it would draft the first story. And it would look something like this, story 1.1. So if it's a high risk, like say there's a lot of database changes or something like that in this story, and it's a high risk story, you probably want to validate it. Remember how I said like the project owner is kind of like a validator? So if it's a really complex story, it's often a good idea to have your project owner validate that story. As you're doing all these things, I also recommend sometimes clearing your context windows as you work with Cursor. I kind of go over those in the videos after this over each individual agent, but I'm just kind of reconfirming that. So like I said before, we've got our documents, our architecture, brief, front end, PRD, we sharded them, and then we have our Scrum Master developed draft story 1.1. And then once it's validated, or if you choose to validate, you can then hand it off to the developer to go ahead and do those things. You could basically say, hey, go ahead and complete story 1.1. Then as it completes story 1.1, it will do something like this, where it will read the story and you'll see it's actually, in my project here, you see that it's checked out the boxes of these tasks, that it's done. But after the developer is done with that, the developer agent's done developing story 1.1. Oh, let me get to the right pass. After it's finished doing the development, it'll implement some tests. I will then reach out to the QA agent, say, hey, I just finished story 1.1. Please validate everything. Please test everything. And it'll do a bunch of testing and stuff like that. And then when it does a bunch of testing, it'll actually update this markdown file of story 1.1 with, so you see up here, story 1.1, all the stuff it's supposed to do. It then adds things at the bottom. As I scroll down, you'll see QA results. Normally this is empty, but after you run the QA of this, of just kind of your testing, it will say, hey, your dev agent was supposed to develop all these things. It looks like it did all those things. It's done. Awesome. So you update this story from no longer draft, but to done. So you have story 1.1 done. Your developer agents developed it. So developers run all that, and it's made all your changes, and your QA validate everything. Actually, let me go back to where it was. So your developer is developing everything. Your developer agent develops all this stuff. does a bunch of testing, and then he QA validates that everything looks correct. Then everything looks happy and everything looks good. You're like, okay, let's mark that story as done. Now you go back to the Scrum Master and say, hey, I just finished story 1.1. Help me draft the next story. And in this project here, it actually drafted the next story. And you can see it's slightly different than story 1.1. You see it's in draft. And here's all the things that it's supposed to do. As you see, there's no checkboxes and stuff. So my next step after this, I would have the developer pick this up and go ahead and develop this story. If it's a complex story, I may have my project owner validate that there's nothing wrong with this story. Then once again, once my developer's done, I have my QA validate it. I would have, there we go, I would have the Scrum Master develop the next story. If it's high risk, have the PO validate it. Then the PO validates it. Then I do the development sequence. It does all that, does all the development. Then you have your QA test everything, make sure everything looks good. Then mark it as done. And you just kind of go through that story, and you'll go through all these stories that it's kind of building. You'll actually kind of see in your PRD, it kind of broke down how it wants all of those stories and epics to be. Like you'll see functional requirements, non-functional requirements, but then further down, it'll have a broad overview of like, hey, these are what things should be in Epic 1, in Epic 2, Epic 3, Epic 4. Then it has kind of a breakdown, sub-breakdown of what's in each of these. This is kind of what that Scrum Master is reading from and developing in conjunction with reading the architecture and the brief, the front end. That's how it kind of develops each of these stories. Also, you'll kind of see here that here's a YAML of where all the validation and test it did on story 1.1 before I continued to story 1.2. I go in further detail about what each of these agents do. In other videos, this was more of an overview of the workflow and how it all works. So, like I said, you can find that on Bmad Core under User Guide and go right-click and preview. And I would highly recommend following this workflow. It will help you build amazing applications. Thanks, and bye.